It was August 8th, 1963. While most of Britain slept peacefully, a mail train rumbled through the darkness carrying a fortune. Inside one of its carriages sat bags and bags of cash, old banknotes heading to London to be destroyed. Nobody knew that 15 men were waiting in the shadows, ready to pull off the crime of the century. The train left Glasgow at 6:50 p.m, right on schedule. The driver, Jack Mills, had made this journey countless times before. Tonight felt like any other night. He had no idea that in a few hours his name would be plastered across every newspaper in the country. Deep in the English countryside, at a place called Brydeg Bridge near Cheddington, the gang was getting into position. They had spent months planning this moment. They knew exactly when the train would arrive. They knew which carriage held the money. They even knew how many staff members would be on board. Bruce Reynolds was the mastermind behind it all. He wasn't your typical criminal. He was smart, well-spoken, and incredibly organised. For over a year, he had been putting together the perfect team. He needed drivers, fighters, and men who could keep their nerve when things got tense. Most importantly, he needed someone who understood trains. That's where Roger Corddry came in. He was the technical expert, the man who would stop the train. The plan was simple but genius. They would tamper with the railway signals, turning the green light to red. When the train stopped, thinking there was danger ahead, they would strike. The gang had rented a nearby farmhouse called Leatherslade Farm. This would be their hideout after the robbery. They stocked it with food, supplies, and everything they needed to lay low for a few days. They even brought board games to pass the time. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. As midnight approached, the tension was unbearable. These men knew they were about to attempt something that had never been done before. If they succeeded, they would be rich beyond their wildest dreams. If they failed, they would spend decades in prison. Roger Corddry climbed up the signal post with a glove covering the green light and batteries wired to make the red light glow. It was crude but effective. In 1963, railway signals were simple. There were no computers, no cameras, no GPS tracking, just coloured lights and human trust. The gang members took their positions along the railway line. Some hid in the bushes, others waited by their vehicles. Every man knew his job. They had rehearsed this moment over and over, but rehearsing and actually doing it are two very different things. At 3:03 a.m. they heard it. The distant rumble of the approaching train. Hearts started pounding, palms began to sweat. This was really happening. There was no turning back now. The train came around the bend, its headlight cutting through the darkness. Jack Mills saw the red signal ahead and did exactly what he was trained to do. He applied the brakes. The massive train began to slow down, metal wheels screeching against the rails. The train came to a complete stop right where the gang wanted it. Perfect. Everything was going according to plan. Mills sat in the driver's cabin, puzzled. Why would there be a red signal here in the middle of nowhere? His assistant, David Whitby, climbed down to use the trackside telephone to find out what was wrong. But the telephone wire had been cut. Whitby started walking toward the signal to investigate. That's when he saw them. Dark figures emerging from the shadows, his blood ran cold. This wasn't a signal failure. This was an ambush. Whitby ran back toward the train, shouting warnings, but it was too late. The gang was already swarming the locomotive. Within seconds they had overpowered both men. Jack Mills was hit on the head during the struggle. He would never fully recover from that blow. The clock was ticking. The 15-minute robbery had begun. Months before that fateful night, Bruce Reynolds sat in a London pub with a problem. He had heard about the mail trains carrying huge amounts of cash, but he didn't know how to rob one. That's when someone introduced him to a mysterious informant known only as the Ulsterman. This informant had inside knowledge. He knew the routes, the schedules, and most importantly, he knew which train carried the most money. The information didn't come cheap. The gang would have to pay him a share of the loot, but what he told them was worth every penny. The Ulsterman explained that after a bank holiday weekend, one particular train would be loaded with cash. All the banks across Scotland would send their old notes to London for destruction. We're talking about millions of pounds, all in one train carriage. It sounded too good to be true. Reynolds started recruiting carefully. He needed men he could trust absolutely. One wrong person, and the whole operation could fall apart. He brought in Gordon Goody, a tough guy who wasn't afraid of violence. Then came Ronnie Biggs, who was supposed to bring a train driver to move the train after they stopped it. Charlie Wilson joined the team. He was cool under pressure and known for being reliable. Buster Edwards came on board too. He was a family man who wanted one big score so he could give his wife and daughter a better life. Each man brought different skills to the table. The gang started watching the trains. They would sit in cars near the railway line, timing everything. They noted when the train passed how fast it was going and where it might be vulnerable. They were like scientists studying their subject. Finding the perfect location took weeks. It had to be far enough from any station that nobody would come to investigate quickly. It needed to be near a road so they could load the money into their vehicles, and it had to have a signal they could tamper with. Bridgego Bridge checked all the boxes. It was isolated, surrounded by fields, and had a road bridge overhead. Perfect. They drove past it dozens of times, memorizing every detail. They even measured the distance from the signal to where the train would stop. Money was needed up front. They had to buy vehicles, rent the farmhouse, and purchase equipment. Some gang members robbed smaller targets to fund the big job. It was risky, but necessary. Every criminal enterprise needs startup capital. Leatherslade Farm became their headquarters. It was isolated, with a long driveway and no close neighbours. They paid 6 months' rent in cash, telling the owner they were going to use it for a holiday. The owner never suspected a thing. They brought in supplies like they were preparing for a siege: canned food, bread, milk, beer, and cigarettes. They needed to stay hidden for at least a few days after the robbery while the heat died down. The farmhouse would be their fortress. The gang practiced their roles repeatedly. They timed how long it would take to unload the money. They figured out the best way to communicate without radios, which could be intercepted. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. But there was one problem they couldn't solve. Ronnie Biggs was supposed to bring a retired train driver who could move the train after they stopped it. They needed to move it further down the track to a better unloading spot. But when the time came, the driver Biggs brought couldn't figure out the controls. This train was different from the old ones he used to drive. They decided to take the risk anyway. They would make the real driver move the train even though he had been injured. It wasn't ideal, but they had come too far to back out now. Besides, what could go wrong? They had planned everything else perfectly. The gang members said goodbye to their families without explaining where they were going. Some told wives they had a business trip. Others just disappeared without explanation. They knew that after this job, life would never be the same. On the evening of August 7th, they all met at Leatherslade Farm. 15 men, one plan, and a date with destiny. They went over the plan one final time. Everyone knew their position, their job, and their escape route. They tried to sleep, but most couldn't. Adrenaline was pumping too hard. At midnight, they got into their vehicles and drove to Bridgego Bridge. Some wore masks, others had gloves. They carried tools, flashlights, and iron bars. They were ready for anything, or so they thought. The final hours before the robbery felt like years. They smoked cigarettes, checked their watches, and waited. The countryside was silent except for the occasional owl. Then Roger Caudry climbed that signal post and changed the light. There was no going back. When the train appeared, every man felt his stomach tighten. This was the moment of truth. The train stopped exactly where they wanted. The first part of the plan had worked perfectly. Now came the hard part. They had to overwhelm the crew, detach the carriages they didn't need, move the train to the bridge, and unload the money. All in 15 minutes. The gang rushed the locomotive like soldiers storming a beach. David Whitby, the assistant driver, was grabbed immediately. They dragged him off the train and told him to lie face down on the ground. He was terrified, but smart enough not to resist. Jack Mills, the driver, tried to fight back. It was a brave but foolish move. One of the gang members hit him with an iron bar. Mills collapsed, blood streaming from his head. The gang hadn't wanted violence, but things rarely go perfectly during a robbery. They needed Mills to move the train about half a mile down the track to the bridge where their trucks were waiting. But Mills was dazed and bleeding. He could barely stand, let alone operate a train. This was the problem with the backup train driver not knowing the controls. They were stuck. Bruce Reynolds made a quick decision. They would force Mills to do it anyway. They helped him back into the driver's cabin and ordered him to move the train. Mills, frightened and in pain, tried his best. But his hands were shaking and his vision was blurred. Slowly, painfully, the train began to move forward. It was jerky and awkward, but it was moving. The gang members ran alongside, making sure Mills didn't try anything clever. Every second felt like an hour. They could hear the clock ticking in their heads. Finally, the train stopped at Bridigo Bridge. This was the sweet spot. The high-value package carriage was now right next to the road. They could form a human chain and pass the bags directly into their waiting trucks. The plan was coming together, but they had a new problem. The train had more staff than they expected. In the car behind the locomotive, there were 5 postal workers sorting mail. The gang hadn't planned for this. They burst into the carriage and ordered everyone to lie down on the floor. The postal workers were terrified. They had no idea what was happening. Some thought it might be a drill. Others knew immediately it was real. The gang members were wearing masks and carrying weapons. This was no drill. One gang member stayed to guard the postal workers while the others ran to the high-value package coach. This was the carriage that held the fortune. Inside were 128 bags of money. Each bag weighed about 70 pounds and contained thousands of pounds in cash. The door was locked. They hadn't expected that. Someone ran to get tools. They smashed the windows and climbed inside. The postal workers in this carriage were also ordered to the floor. Nobody was going to be a hero tonight. Now the real work began. The gang formed a human chain from the train to their trucks. They passed bag after bag, working like a factory assembly line. Grab a bag, pass it to the next man, grab another bag. The bags were heavy and awkward. Sweat poured down their faces despite the cool night air. Some bags split open, spilling banknotes onto the ground. The gang scrambled to pick up the loose cash. They couldn't leave evidence behind. Every pound note mattered. This was the score of a lifetime. The men worked in almost complete silence. No unnecessary talking, no celebrations, just focused, intense work. They could hear their own breathing inside the masks. The smell of sweat and fear filled the air. 12 minutes had passed. They had grabbed most of the money, but not all of it. Should they keep going, or get out while they could? Every extra minute increased the risk of getting caught, but leaving money behind felt like failure. Reynolds made the call. Take a few more bags, then go. They grabbed another dozen bags and threw them into the trucks. That would have to be enough. Time was up. The gang members jumped into their vehicles, 3 Land Rovers and a truck, all loaded with cash. They fired up the engines and drove away from the bridge, leaving the train crew tied up and terrified behind them. As they sped down the country lanes toward Leatherslade Farm, they couldn't believe it. They had actually done it. They had stopped a moving train and stolen a fortune. The biggest robbery in British history had just happened, and they had pulled it off. But in their rush and excitement, they made mistakes. Mistakes that would soon come back to haunt them. The sun rose on August 8, 1963, revealing a crime scene that shocked Britain. The train crew was discovered by another railway worker who noticed the stopped train. When he arrived, he found the postal workers still lying on the floor, too scared to move, even though the robbers were long gone. Jack Mills was rushed to the hospital. The head injury he suffered during the robbery was serious. He would suffer from headaches and trauma for the rest of his life. The image of an innocent train driver being attacked would turn public opinion against the robbers. At Leatherslade Farm, the gang was celebrating. They spread the money across the floor of the farmhouse and stared at it in disbelief. There were piles and piles of banknotes everywhere. It looked like a scene from a movie. They started counting, but quickly realized it was impossible. There was just too much money. They estimated they had grabbed somewhere between 2 and 3 million pounds. In today's money, that would be over 50 million pounds. They had actually done it. Each man would get an equal share minus payments to the Ulsterman informant and a few others who had helped. Even after those cuts, each robber would walk away with around $150,000. That was more money than most people earned in a lifetime, but the celebration was short-lived. They turned on the radio and heard the news. The robbery was already the top story across Britain. Police were calling it the crime of the century. Roadblocks were being set up. Every officer in the country was looking for them. The gang had planned to stay at the farm for a few days, but now they weren't so sure. The heat was intense. Maybe they should split up and leave immediately, but that would mean dividing the money quickly and potentially making mistakes. Bruce Reynolds insisted they stick to the plan. Stay low, wait for things to cool down, then leave quietly. They had enough supplies. The farm was isolated. Nobody knew they were there. Panicking now would be stupid. Meanwhile, Detective Superintendent Malcolm Futrell was arriving at the crime scene. He was an experienced officer who had solved many cases, but nothing had prepared him for this. A train robbery? It seemed like something from an American Western movie, not real life in England. Futrell examined everything. The tampered signal, the stopped train, the discarded mailbags. He knew immediately that this wasn't the work of amateurs. This robbery had been planned carefully by professionals. Finding them would be difficult but not impossible. The police started interviewing witnesses. The postal workers described the robbers as organised and efficient. They had worn masks, but a few workers noticed details. One robber had a distinctive voice. Another was very tall. Small clues, but clues nonetheless. The biggest break came when police started searching the area around the crime scene. They found tyre tracks leading away from the bridge. The trucks had been heavy, loaded with money, and had left deep impressions in the soft ground. Officers followed the tracks down country lanes. They were faint in places but visible enough to follow. The trail led generally north. The police brought in tracking dogs. They were getting closer. Back at the farm, the gang was getting restless. Being cooped up with 14 other men and millions of pounds in cash creates tension. Some wanted to leave, others wanted to stay. Arguments broke out. Bruce Reynolds had to play peacemaker constantly. They passed time playing Monopoly, which was ironic considering they had just stolen a fortune in real money. They drank beer, smoked cigarettes, and tried not to think about the massive manhunt happening outside. But they were making critical mistakes. They left fingerprints everywhere, on bottles, on plates, on the Monopoly board. They should have been wearing gloves constantly, but they got comfortable. Comfort breeds carelessness. The plan was to burn down the farmhouse before they left. Fire would destroy all evidence. But as the days passed, they kept delaying. One more day, they told themselves, just one more day to make sure everything was safe. On August 11th, 3 days after the robbery, they finally decided to leave. They loaded their shares of money into bags and prepared to go their separate ways. Each man would leave at different times, taking different routes. But before leaving, they were supposed to clean the farmhouse thoroughly and start the fire. They wiped down some surfaces, but not all. They were tired and wanted to get away. The cleaning was rushed and incomplete. Charlie Wilson left first, driving away in the early morning, then Buster Edwards. One by one, the gang members departed, each carrying a fortune in cash. By the evening, the farmhouse was empty. They had left the fire-starting job to the last man out. But in their haste, nobody confirmed who that was. Each person thought someone else would do it. The farmhouse stood intact, filled with evidence. The gang scattered across Britain. Some went to London, others went to their homes, a few went to pre-arranged safe houses. They felt relieved to be away from the farm and away from each other. Now they could enjoy their money in peace. But peace was the last thing they would get. On August 13th, 1963, a herdsman named John Maris was checking on his cows in a field near Leatherslade Farm. He noticed something odd. A Land Rover was parked in a strange place, partially hidden behind some trees. It looked abandoned. Curious, Maris walked closer. The vehicle was covered in dirt and looked like it had been driven hard. He peered inside and saw empty food containers and cigarette butts. Something wasn't right. He decided to report it to the police. When Detective Sergeant Stan Davies arrived to investigate, he followed the trail from the Land Rover back to Leatherslade Farm. The farmhouse looked empty, but the front door was unlocked. That was strange. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. What he saw made his jaw drop. The farmhouse was a mess. Empty food cans were scattered everywhere. Dirty plates piled in the sink, beer bottles covered the tables, and then he saw them, mail bags. Lots of mail bags with post office printed on them. Davies immediately radioed for backup. He knew he had found something big. Within hours, the farmhouse was swarming with police officers. Detective Superintendent Malcolm Futrell arrived and couldn't believe their luck. The gang's hideout had been found. The forensic team moved in carefully. They photographed everything, every bottle, every plate, every surface. This farmhouse was a treasure trove of evidence. The gang had lived here for days, and criminals always leave traces. The fingerprint experts got to work. They dusted everything. Door handles, bottles, plates, windows, even the Monopoly board. Fingerprints appeared everywhere. Clear, perfect fingerprints. The gang's biggest mistake was becoming obvious. Police found more Land Rovers hidden in a garage. These vehicles had been used in the robbery. The tyre treads matched the tracks found near Brydeg Bridge. Everything was connecting. The police were building an unbeatable case. Inside the farmhouse, investigators found scraps of paper with notes. Someone had been keeping track of money divisions. The handwriting would later help identify gang members. They also found maps with the robbery location circled. But the biggest discovery was what they didn't find. The money. The gang had taken every penny with them. Not a single banknote was left behind. They might have been careless with evidence, but they weren't careless with the cash. The police began running the fingerprints through their database. In 1963, this was a slow process done by hand. But one by one, matches started coming back. Bruce Reynolds, Gordon Goody, Charlie Wilson. Names the police knew well. The media went wild. Reporters descended on the farm. Photographers took pictures from every angle. The farmhouse became famous overnight. Everyone wanted to see where the Great Train Robbers had hidden. Police started raiding homes across London. They knew who they were looking for now. The fingerprints had given them names. Now they just needed to find the men. Arrest warrants were issued. The net was closing. Charlie Wilson was arrested first. Police burst into his home early one morning. They searched everywhere but found no money. Wilson stayed calm and silent. He refused to answer any questions. Without the cash, the case was weaker, but they had his fingerprints. Gordon Goody was next. He was arrested at his mother's house. Again, no money was found. Goody also refused to talk, but the evidence didn't need his confession. The fingerprints spoke loudly enough. One by one, gang members were arrested over the following weeks. Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, Jim Hussey. The police were making excellent progress, but some of the key members were still free. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, had disappeared completely. He had planned for this possibility. He had fake documents, hiding places, and money stashed away. Finding him would be difficult. Ronnie Biggs was also on the run. He knew the police would come for him eventually. His fingerprints were all over the farmhouse. He started planning his escape even before the police came knocking. Buster Edwards had fled to Germany with his family. He used some of his robbery money to set up a new life, but living as a fugitive isn't easy, especially with a wife and young child. The stress was enormous. The police interrogated the arrested gang members for hours. They used every technique they knew. But these were hardened criminals who understood the game. They said nothing. Absolute silence. The code of the underworld was holding firm. But the police didn't need confessions. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, tire tracks, the abandoned farmhouse. The case was strong. Very strong. The public was fascinated by the robbery. Some people saw the gang as modern-day Robin Hoods, though they hadn't given any money to the poor. Others were angry about the violence against Jack Mills. Opinion was divided. The arrested gang members were charged with robbery and conspiracy. They were held in high-security prisons while awaiting trial. Bail was denied. These were dangerous men who had pulled off an incredible crime. Back at Leatherslade Farm, police continued searching. They dug up the garden looking for buried money. They checked the walls for hiding places. They found nothing. The money had vanished completely. The question everyone was asking became louder every day. Where was the money? On January 20th, 1964, the trial began at Aylesbury Crown Court. It would become one of the longest and most expensive trials in British history. 12 gang members sat in the dock, facing charges of robbery and conspiracy. The courthouse was surrounded by police. Crowds gathered outside hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous robbers. Journalists from around the world had come to cover the trial. The Great Train Robbery had captured everyone's imagination. The prosecution case was simple but powerful. They had fingerprints. They had the farmhouse. They had the vehicles. They had the mailbags. The evidence was overwhelming. Each piece connected the defendants directly to the crime. The defense lawyers had a tough job. How do you defend clients when their fingerprints are all over the crime scene? They tried various strategies. Some claimed the fingerprints were planted. Others argued their clients had been at the farm innocently, but the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was too strong. Fingerprints don't lie. The tire tracks matched. The timeline fit perfectly. These were the men who had robbed the train. The trial lasted 51 days. Witnesses testified about what they saw and heard. Jack Mills described the attack and how he still suffered from headaches. His testimony was emotional and powerful. The violence had turned what might have been seen as a clever crime into something darker. The postal workers described their terror during the robbery. They talked about being ordered to lie on the floor, not knowing if they would be killed. Their fear was real and haunting. Expert witnesses explained the fingerprint evidence. They showed how each print matched perfectly to specific defendants. The science was clear and undeniable. These men had been at Leatherslade Farm. The defence tried to poke holes in the evidence. They questioned the chain of custody. They suggested contamination, but every challenge was met with solid answers. The prosecution had built an airtight case. The defendants maintained their silence. They didn't testify in their own defence. This was strategic. Without taking the stand, they couldn't be cross-examined, but it also meant the jury never heard their side of the story. As the trial went on, the public mood shifted. Initially, some people had admired the gang's boldness, but seeing Jack Mills in court, still suffering from his injuries, changed minds. This wasn't a victimless crime. The judge, Justice Edmund Davies, made it clear he took the crime very seriously. His stern demeanour indicated that if convicted, the sentences would be harsh. Very harsh. After weeks of testimony, the prosecution rested. The defence had little to offer in response. They made their closing arguments, but everyone knew the outcome was certain. The jury deliberated for 3 days. This wasn't because the evidence was unclear. It was because there was so much of it to review. Every fingerprint, every photograph, every witness statement needed to be considered. On March 26, 1964, the jury returned. The courtroom was packed. The tension was unbearable. The foreman stood up. Guilty. All defendants were found guilty of robbery. Some were also found guilty of conspiracy and receiving stolen goods. The courtroom erupted. Families of the convicted men cried. Some shouted. Police had to restore order. The guilty men showed little emotion. They had expected this outcome, but nobody expected what came next. The sentencing. Justice Edmund Davies stood up. His face was stern. He began by condemning the robbery as a crime that had struck at the heart of British society. The violence against Jack Mills was particularly troubling. Then he pronounced the sentences. 30 years. Each gang member received 30 years in prison. The courtroom gasped. 30 years was almost unheard of for a robbery where nobody had been killed. The sentences were meant to send a message. If you commit such a bold, violent crime, you will pay dearly. The British justice system would not tolerate this kind of behaviour. The gang members were stunned. They had expected prison, but 10 or 15 years at most. 30 years meant they would be old men when they got out. It meant missing their children growing up. It meant losing the best years of their lives. Roger Caudry, who had tampered with the signals, received a slightly shorter sentence because he cooperated with police. But everyone else got the full 30 years. It was devastating. The newspapers ran massive headlines. Train gang gets 307 years total. The sentences were debated across Britain. Some thought they were fair. Others thought they were too harsh. The robbery had only taken 15 minutes after all. But the judge was firm in his reasoning. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the planning, the violence, and the damage to public trust. Such crimes had to be punished severely. The convicted men were split up and sent to different high-security prisons across Britain. The authorities didn't want them together where they could plan escapes. Each man would serve his time alone. Meanwhile, 3 key gang members were still free. Bruce Reynolds, Ronnie Biggs, and Buster Edwards had avoided capture. They were living as fugitives, constantly looking over their shoulders. The police had frozen any bank accounts connected to the arrested men. They searched properties and questioned family members, but the stolen money remained missing. Most of it had simply vanished. The convicted gang members refused to tell police where the money was hidden. Even facing 30 years, they wouldn't betray the code. The money was their insurance policy, something to come back to when they were finally released. As the prison doors slammed shut, the convicted men faced a grim reality. They were now among Britain's most famous criminals. But fame came at a terrible price. Charlie Wilson had been in Winson Green Prison for just 4 months when it happened. On August 12, 1964, 3 men scaled the prison wall using a rope ladder. They overpowered a guard and made their way to Wilson's cell. Wilson was asleep when they burst in. They woke him up and told him to come quickly. He barely had time to grab his shoes before they were running through the prison yard. Within minutes, they were over the wall and into a waiting car. The escape was brilliant. Someone on the outside had planned it perfectly. They knew the guard schedules, the layout, and how to get in and out quickly. Wilson vanished into the night, free once again. The escape made headlines across Britain. How could a high-security prisoner simply walk out? The prison system was embarrassed. The police were furious. Wilson was now one of the most wanted men in Britain. Wilson fled to France using false documents and dyed hair. He lived quietly in a small town, trying not to draw attention. But living as a fugitive is expensive and stressful. The robbery money was running out faster than expected. Meanwhile, Ronnie Biggs was planning his own escape. He was in Wandsworth Prison, supposedly one of the most secure facilities in Britain. But no prison is completely escape-proof if you have money and determination. On July 8th, 1965, Biggs and 3 other prisoners made their move. A furniture van pulled up to the prison wall. Men inside the van positioned a ladder. Biggs and his companions climbed the prison wall during their exercise period. Guards spotted them and sounded the alarm, but it was too late. The prisoners reached the top of the wall and jumped into the waiting van. The van sped away through London streets. Biggs was free. The escape was even more embarrassing for the authorities than Wilson's. 2 train robbers had now escaped from supposedly secure prisons. The public was both amazed and alarmed. Were these men criminal geniuses, or was the prison system just incompetent? Biggs fled to Paris, then to Australia, and eventually to Brazil. He chose Brazil because it had no extradition treaty with Britain. Once there, he could live openly without fear of being sent back. Buster Edwards, who had never been caught, was living in Germany with his wife and daughter. But the stress was killing him. He couldn't work legally. He was always worried about being recognised. His wife missed England terribly. After a few years, Edwards made a surprising decision. He decided to turn himself in. In 1966, he contacted British authorities and arranged his surrender. He received the same 30-year sentence as the others, but at least the running was over. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, proved harder to catch. He fled to Mexico, then France, then Belgium. He moved constantly, never staying anywhere long enough to be traced. He was living off the robbery money, but that was dwindling. Reynolds developed a drug habit to cope with the stress. Being a fugitive sounds romantic, but it's actually miserable. No real friends, no permanent home, always looking over your shoulder. The money that was supposed to bring freedom had become a prison. Back in Britain, the police never gave up. They tracked down family members and known associates. They followed money trails. They worked with international police forces. Finding the escaped robbers became a matter of pride. Charlie Wilson was found in 1968 in Canada. He had been living under a false name, working as a carpenter. Police had tracked him through financial transactions. He was arrested and extradited back to Britain to finish his sentence. Wilson was devastated. He had been free for 4 years, living a relatively normal life. Now he was back behind bars with years still to serve. The escape had bought him temporary freedom but made his eventual return to prison even harder. Ronnie Biggs became the most famous fugitive. From Brazil, he gave interviews to British newspapers. He taunted the police, saying they would never catch him. He became a celebrity of sorts, a symbol of the outlaw who got away. Biggs survived in Brazil by selling his story to journalists and tourists. People would pay to meet the famous train robber. He lived modestly but openly. The Brazilian authorities couldn't touch him because of the extradition laws. The British police tried everything to get Biggs back. They attempted kidnapping, which failed spectacularly. They pressured Brazilian officials, but the law was clear. As long as Biggs stayed in Brazil, he was safe. Bruce Reynolds remained free longer than any other gang member. He wasn't caught until 1968. Police found him in Torquay, living in a small apartment. The money was gone. The adventure was over. He looked tired and defeated. Reynolds received his 30-year sentence and was sent to prison. He wrote in his memoirs later that prison was almost a relief. The running was exhausting. At least in prison he could sleep without fear of a midnight knock on the door. The Great Train Robbers were now almost all behind bars. Some had escaped briefly, but most had been recaptured. The only one still free was Ronnie Biggs, living his strange celebrity life in Brazil. Inside prison, the gang members adapted to their sentences. Some became model prisoners, others continued to cause trouble. They were kept separate to prevent them from planning anything together. The prison system was determined not to let any more escapes happen. The train robbers were watched constantly. Their visitors were screened. Their mail was read. They were the most secure prisoners in Britain. Years began to pass. The 1960s became the 1970s. The Great Train Robbery started to fade from daily headlines. But the fascination never completely died. It remained one of the most famous crimes in British history. The gang members behind bars could only wait and hope for early release. Time does strange things to criminals and their crimes. As the years passed, the Great Train Robbery transformed from a shocking crime into something almost legendary. The gang members became folk heroes to some, even though they were convicted felons serving long sentences. By the mid-1970s, some gang members were being released on parole. They had served around 10 to 12 years of their 30-year sentences. British authorities decided that keeping them locked up for the full 30 years was excessive, especially for a non-violent robbery by most standards. Bobby Welch was released in 1976. He walked out of prison into a world that had changed dramatically. The 1960s were gone. Music, fashion, and attitudes had all evolved. He was middle-aged now, with most of his youth spent behind bars. Tommy Wisby got out around the same time. Both men struggled to adjust to freedom. Finding legitimate work was nearly impossible. Who would hire a famous train robber? They were celebrities of the worst kind, recognised everywhere but welcomed nowhere. Gordon Goody was released in 1975. Unlike some others, he managed to stay out of trouble. He moved to Spain and lived quietly, occasionally giving interviews about the robbery. He never expressed much remorse, viewing the crime as a job that went well until it didn't. Bruce Reynolds was released in 1978 after serving 10 years. He came out to a hero's welcome from certain elements of London's criminal underworld, but he was broke. All the money was gone. The 15 minutes that made him rich had cost him 10 years of freedom. Reynolds tried to go straight. He wrote books about the robbery. He gave interviews and appeared on television. The public's appetite for the story never seemed to fade. People wanted to hear from the man who had planned it all. Charlie Wilson was released in 1978 as well. He tried to retire from crime but found it difficult. The money from the robbery was long spent. He needed income. Eventually he got involved in drug trafficking, which would prove to be a fatal mistake. In 1990, Charlie Wilson was murdered in Spain. He was shot at his villa by a hitman on a bicycle. The drug world is far more dangerous than train robbery. Wilson's death was brutal and sad. The man who had escaped prison and lived as a fugitive died violently in what should have been his retirement. Buster Edwards, who had turned himself in, was released in 1975. He tried various jobs, but nothing worked out. Eventually, he opened a flower stall outside Waterloo Station in London. It was humble work, but honest. He became a local character, selling flowers to commuters. But Edwards struggled with depression and guilt. The robbery had seemed like a path to a better life, but it had brought only misery. In 1994, he was found hanged in his lock-up garage. The official verdict was suicide. The Great Train Robbery had claimed another victim. Jack Mills, the train driver who was injured during the robbery, never fully recovered. The head injury affected him for the rest of his life. He suffered from chronic headaches and depression. He died in 1970, just 7 years after the robbery, aged 64. Mills's family always believed the robbery shortened his life. The physical injury combined with the psychological trauma broke him. He received no compensation worth mentioning. He was the forgotten victim in a story that celebrated the criminals. Ronnie Biggs remained in Brazil, becoming more famous with each passing year. He appeared in music videos, gave countless interviews, and even recorded songs. He had turned his fugitive status into a brand. He was the train robber who got away. But life in exile wasn't as glamorous as it seemed. Biggs couldn't return to Britain to see his family without being arrested. He lived in constant limbo, neither truly free nor imprisoned. His son from a Brazilian relationship kept him from being deported due to Brazilian law. By the 1990s, Biggs was getting old and sick. He developed several health problems. The Brazilian sun and celebrity lifestyle couldn't protect him from aging. He began to reconsider his choices. In 2001, Ronnie Biggs made a shocking decision. He voluntarily returned to Britain. He flew back knowing he would be arrested immediately and sent to prison. He wanted to die in his home country, even if that meant dying in a prison cell. Biggs was arrested at the airport and sent to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. He was 71 years old, sick, and no longer the dashing fugitive of legend. The public debate over whether to keep such an elderly man in prison raged for years. Finally, in 2009, on compassionate grounds due to his failing health, Biggs was released from prison. He had served a total of 13 years between his original imprisonment and his return. He lived in a care home, barely able to speak due to strokes. Ronnie Biggs died in 2013 at age 84. He had outlived most of his fellow robbers. In his final interviews, he expressed some regret but also defended the robbery as a victimless crime, though Jack Mills' family strongly disagreed with that assessment. Bruce Reynolds died in 2013 as well, just months before Biggs. He had lived quietly in his later years, still giving occasional interviews. He remained unapologetic about the robbery until the end, seeing it as the defining achievement of his life. The money was never recovered. Of the $2.6 million stolen, only a fraction was ever found by police. Most gang members claim they spent their shares quickly or lost them. Some speculated that money was still hidden somewhere, waiting to be found. The reality is probably simpler. The money was spent on living expenses, lawyers, bribes, and funding escapes. Being a fugitive is expensive. The fortune that seemed so huge in 1963 disappeared quickly when divided among 15 men and various helpers. Leatherslade Farm became a tourist attraction for crime enthusiasts. The owner eventually sold it, and it changed hands several times. The connection to the robbery both increased and decreased its value depending on the buyer. The mail train service that was robbed eventually stopped running. Technology and changes in banking made it obsolete. The world that the train robbers lived in, where millions in cash were transported by train, gradually disappeared. The Great Train Robbery entered British culture permanently. It was referenced in movies, songs, books, and television shows. The story had everything: planning, execution, escape, and capture. It was the perfect crime story. But behind the legend were real consequences. A train driver who was injured and died young. Families torn apart by imprisonment. Children who grew up without fathers. The stolen money belonged to banks, but the human cost was very real. The gang members who survived their sentences often expressed mixed feelings. Some regretted it deeply. Others only regretted getting caught. A few maintained it was worth it, even with the prison time. The robbery raised important questions about crime and punishment. Were 30-year sentences appropriate for a robbery where only one person was injured? Should criminals who become folk heroes be treated differently? There were no easy answers. The British public remained fascinated. Opinion polls showed that many people, while not condoning the crime, found the story exciting. There was something about the audacity of it that captured the imagination. In the end, the Great Train Robbery was both a success and a failure. The gang did pull off an incredible heist. They stole a fortune and escaped. But they were caught, imprisoned, and the money vanished. Was it worth it? That depends on who you ask. For Jack Mills and his family, it was a tragedy that destroyed lives. For the gang members who spent years in prison, it was a costly mistake disguised as a victory. For the British public, it became a fascinating story of daring and consequences. 60 years later, the Great Train Robbery remains one of the most famous crimes in history. Not because it was the biggest or the most violent, but because of the story it told. A story of ambition, planning, success, and ultimate failure. The 15 minutes that made headlines in 1963 created ripples that lasted decades. Every gang member paid a price, some with years in prison, some with their sanity, some with their lives. The robbery that was supposed to set them free ended up imprisoning them all. The last surviving member of the gang died in 2017. With his death, the direct connection to that August night in 1963 was finally broken. The Great Train Robbery had passed from living memory into history, but the story lives on. It's told in documentaries, books, and articles. New generations discover it and are fascinated by the same questions. How did they do it? Why did they get caught? Where did the money go? Perhaps the most important lesson is the oldest one. Crime doesn't pay. The gang stole millions but ended up with nothing. They lost their freedom, their families, and in some cases their lives. The treasure they sought became their curse. The Great Train Robbery was 15 minutes of action that created lifetimes of consequences. It was the crime of the century that nobody truly won.